Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining into this webinar on the power of pay transparency and how to navigate the complexity. As we keep welcoming people slightly more and more, we hope to welcome not only more attendees to the webinar, but also the last panelist and Ali that will be coming in from Juno that might be having a few technical issues. But let's start the webinar. I'm pretty sure they'll make him come pretty quickly. Let's start the webinar with a roundtable on who's who in this webinar. And over to you, Mariabrisa. Can you tell us more about who you are, your company, and so on before we start a bit more in depth?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Mariabrisa. I'm the Chief People Officer at Owkin. We are a biotech that uses artificial intelligence and machine learning in order to get deeper into the element of precision medicine and treat unmet medical needs. So yeah, excited to be here and excited to discuss about this.
Thank you for coming in, Mariabrisa. Over to you, Theo.
Hi, everyone. I'm Theo. I'm one of the founders of Otta. We help people find jobs in tech and also help innovative companies make great hires. We now have over 1 million candidates on the platform and also work with thousands of companies.
Thank you, Theo. And waiting for Ali from Juno to come in and jump into the conversation, I'll introduce myself. I'm Virgile. I'm CEO and co-founder of Figures. At Figures, we help company navigate through uncertainty and take control of their salary policy. And we help companies make fair and efficient salary policy. We have over 1,200 clients in Europe as of today. And I'm very, very happy to be able to moderate this webinar on pay transparency, which has become one of the hottest buzzwords recently. A lot of people are talking about pay transparency and from all type of angles, right? Whether it's candidates, employees, HR leaders, lawmakers, everyone starts talking about pay transparency, which is interesting because I'm not sure that even within this webinar and within these attendees, we all have the same definition of pay transparency. In fact, we use the same word for different layers and different levels of transparency. And everyone assumes that everyone talks about the same thing, but it's often not the case, right? And I think it's good to kick off this webinar by ensuring we are talking effectively about the same thing when we're talking about pay transparency. It's something with layers, right? And with options. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not a very binary option. We are transparent or we're not transparent, right? And I'll start with the way we'd like to frame things at Figures when we work with our clients on pay transparency and getting towards pay transparency or progressing towards pay transparency is that we think that there's the first step of transparency is being a bit more transparent around the company's pay policy and compensation policy. So how do we want to pay? Who are we competing against in terms of talent? What's our positioning on the market? That's the first step in terms of transparency, being a bit more open toward that. We define the second step by being a bit more open and transparent about our processes. How do we determine the right salary or right compensation package when hiring someone? How do we run compensation reviews? What's the process there? The first step being a bit more transparency on the salary grid and the salary bands, starting with internal transparency, right? Being transparent towards employees on what are the applicable salary ranges per role, per location, per seniority level. Then I think then only we start having the external transparency is more and more transparent towards the external world, which is mostly candidates, which we're going to talk about. And then and only then what we'd like to call, and I'd like to see if we have the same definition, right? The ultimate transparency is where everyone knows, mostly internally, who earns what in the company, right? And often people assume pay transparency is this ultimate stage, but as I outlined, there's multiple steps in before that ultimate stage of ultimate pay transparency and who earns what within the company, and everyone knows everyone else's salary. And in fact, I think before letting Theo talk about what I think is his favorite topic is like transparency as a link between transparency and the job market, right, and recruiting. Mariabrisa, do you agree with those different layers, or would you add some subtleties into that?
No, I absolutely agree. And I think I might have flipped them. I think first, is around the transparency for the candidates and knowing that, they're getting a fair pay for their role. And then how do you then translate that into pay transparency within the organization that equally balances need for transparency, and yet the fairness of acknowledging the journey that an employee can have within one same role, and not everybody being at the same moment in that journey within the same role, and how do you reward around that, and then what are the implications about transparency when you look at that, and then to your point, the ultimate sum of transparency is everybody knowing everything, and what is the value add for that, and what is the purpose of doing that, and looking at how that can be achieved, based on what you have available in your organization and what you need to put in place for that to be successful, if that is possible.
And that's exactly the topic of today. Right? How contextual, what do you need to place in your organization, and how different it is per company stage, and so on. And we're going to discuss into that. But before I leave it to Theo to share more of his thoughts, I want to make Ali. Ali, introduce yourself to the audience. Ali, what you and Juno, tell us more.
Very sorry that I'm late. I was on the wrong link, apparently. I'm Ali. I'm the founder and CEO of Juno. We really kind of want to reinvigorate and revitalize the way employees experience their benefits. It's all about flexibility. It's about inclusion. It's about being able to provide a diverse range of benefits for a global workforce. So we have people in 74 countries worldwide using our platform where they can pick and choose what benefits matter to them, rather than taking a set menu of, traditionally companies will offer you 3 or 4 things. And of course, they leave out a very large swathe of employees. So we're trying to democratize access to benefits and well-being. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for the presentation. And you're going to talk about your transition to paid transparency a bit later on. And before I hand it over to Theo, it feels like I've said that 5 times, right? Before handing it over to Theo, quick notes for everyone. We have a question tab at the bottom right corner of the application of Livestorm. If you've never been there, please ask questions throughout the event, and please upvote the question that you think are the more relevant. That will dictate the way, the order we're going to try to take questions as we go, right? But we need you to ask your question in the question tab throughout the webinar. Now, I swear it's over to you, Theo. I stopped interrupting you. Tell us more about transparency and your perspective within your domain.
Yeah, thank you. So I thought I would just start off by giving a bit of a candidate perspective. So people looking for jobs, that's the main way that we talk about salary transparency at Otta. We can talk a little bit more, obviously, later on about how we think about pay transparency internally and so on. But in terms of the candidate perspective, the angle that we come at it from is that seeing a salary range on a job is the number one thing that candidates look for in job ads. So we have 1 million plus candidates on Otta now. And one thing that we did a while ago is tested a feature on Otta that let job seekers ask companies for more information about their jobs, and they could specify what it was they were interested in learning more about. And when we did that, we saw that 93% of candidates said that salary was the most important factor when reading a job description. So if you're missing that information on a job ad, like many are today, then that's massively putting off candidates. Another angle that I wanted to kind of bring there is that it used to be quite taboo to talk about salaries. I think 5-10 years ago, this wasn't really a topic of conversation, but it's our belief now that people are really ready to talk about pay. We've had multiple viral campaigns that people very active on LinkedIn may have seen that kind of prove the appetite there to talk about it. Earlier last year, we created a post that went viral, got over 5 million views and a massive amount of engagement, and it still kind of goes around the internet today, where we said, if the salary is so competitive, why don't you tell me what it is? Because so many jobs have this line on their competitive salary that is quite meaningless. The other thing that I've also observed in the last 6 months is that there are now multiple TikTok accounts of people going around on the street, talking to people in the street about their salaries, what do they earn. People are more happy to be open. They talk to their friends about it. And this really helps people to make more informed decisions about their career. So that's the kind of candidate perspective on salary transparency, I'd say.
And one thing important to add to what you just said, right? So the context is changing, where people feel more and more at ease talking about salaries, what was more and more taboo. Of course, it's different from different culture, right? And some more culture are a lot more likely to talk about salaries, while some culture are still a lot more taboo. And I don't know, Mariabrisa, maybe you want to add something on that, given your very international and multicultural career, but it's very different from one country to another, the desire or to talk about salary quite openly.
No, indeed, I do think there are cultural differences in terms of how acceptant it is to talk about salary. I do agree with what Theo was saying in terms of that being a key element of importance. I think the other layer though to put into it is that you have to differentiate companies that have different offerings. So for example, how do you look at it when you're looking at a startup where the salary in itself is one part of the offering, but actually the equity part is a huge part of the element, and it hasn't gone public. So how do you contemplate for that, and then the benefits versus a non-comparable with a more structured, bigger company of which their compensation is more salary. And so I think beyond just the cultural element, it's also the how to make sure that we can do that, but in a way that really transpires the full story and context of what the company has to offer to the candidate, which can influence where the base salary is put. So I think that's another element and layer to add to that.
But in fact, it's a perfect transition, because I was about to say that there's another element which is very important to keep in mind, is a change in legislation, whether that's occurred when we look at what's happening in the US, and whether that's about to occur when we're talking about what's going to happen in UK and in Europe in the next coming years, right? But we're going to get back to that later on. And you were talking about different culture, different contexts. I think it's the right moment to start asking Ali about their journey at Juno around pay transparency. And Ali, can you tell us more about where you started, some elements of context of how many employees you had at the time when you started your journey, and where did you go and how did it go?
Yeah, thanks, Virgile. First of all, Theo, I love Otta, and I think you probably know that already. And Virgile, we've used figures as well, and really love what you're doing. So I think it's helped us a lot, Theo. Working with Otta, definitely at the beginnings for a while now. For us, it's really important, transparency as a whole, right? As a subject, as a topic, as a culture, and as a form of leadership. The irony is that the thing that we are not very transparent with, unlike everything else, is salary. But I'll come to that in a moment. We are international by default. It would be totally not in keeping with our values to not have people from all around the world working for Juno. Now, we have people in South America, we have people all across Europe, and since the beginning, we've hired internationally. In terms of transparency, what we espouse is, first of all of our job ads have a salary range. I used to work for a company where I got chided for putting a salary on a job description, and I just thought that was crazy. You need to put what you expect to pay people. This is such an important topic, this topic of salary, and yet there's a taboo around it. I'm sure there are other topics that have taboos that are so vital, but that to me is important. Be very transparent about pay. As Mariabrisa mentioned, it is nuanced though, in a startup, because first of all, for us, since the beginning, we've been very transparent culturally, and I can come to that in a moment, but you can offer certain people negotiations on equity, on benefits, on pay in different regions. I think it's important as well that we're very small, and a lot of the people that have come in with, let's say, less experience, but we've given them an opportunity to really, because of their potential, really grow into a role, which means that they've actually ended up probably earning more where they are with us than they might in a more traditional business with a more structured pay structure, for example. But from our perspective, transparency is super important in the sense that everybody knows at all times how much money the company has in the bank. It was very uncomfortable during the weekend, of course, but we know how much burn we have left. We know how much runway we have left. We know if there's feedback about me that's positive, negative, I share that. We try and be as transparent as possible, communicate very effectively. I think it's good leadership to do that. In terms of pay, though, it's definitely an area where we haven't necessarily been as good as we could be.
One point there, before I keep a little bit of suspense and before getting to the topic of pay transparency, then why? There's an open question of people start to forget, I think, why are you being transparent? Why did you mention leadership? What's the purpose behind being transparent with your employees on cash, on runway and stuff like that? Why are you doing it? Because I guess you're not doing it just for the sake of being transparent. Why do you do that? Why is it so important to you?
I mean, a startup is unique in the sense that regardless of the seniority, you're kind of all in it together. You know, it's a challenge. It's almost like a war in many cases. You know, you have to band together and do something to a common cause. For us, of course, it's to improve the lives of others and to, you know, do away with the old way of providing benefits, which just haven't fit for purpose. So when you share troubles and share positives, you know, positives and negatives, and not everything is fantastic, and you can share sometimes. As a leader, when I feel stressed and burnt out and so on and so forth, I think it is very important to create that bound together culture where people feel connected with each other, you know, through that common experience. Moreover, we're all adults and we're smart and we know when things aren't potentially going well, or when we know when things are happening in the company. So it's always better for leadership to be transparent, you know, to talk about things that are affecting the business. I've worked for companies in the past where it's like there's an ivory tower of decisions being made and stuff going on with fundraising or with other situations, and everybody else is left in the dark. And it creates that cultural rift, that gulf between senior management and everybody else. And then they start wondering, why aren't people being motivated? Why are people leaving us? Why is it that they're not communicating? Why are things not getting done? It's that, I think, at least.
So I think, and I'm going to ask Theo there. What do you think? Do you agree that like transparency is like a form of generating trust and changing the relationship between like companies and leadership and employees?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that point about transparency, and it's something that we think about a lot from many different angles. I think, like specifically going back to salary transparency, there are a few points that I think about where it like really helps the company and just the whole market collectively be better. So the first one I'd say is that salary transparency, when it comes to recruitment, makes it much easier to attract great talent. I think removing salary secrecy unlocks more applications from the right people, because people know whether it's going to be a fit for them, rather than making an application, they get all the way through to the end of the process and then there's a misalignment there. You get more applications. We've shown this on Otta that you get 66% more applications if you have a transparent salary range on your job, regardless of what the salary is. Even if you're not super competitive, it still helps you attract the people at the right level. So if you're not being transparent there, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. I think two other things that I'd mention. I think it also builds like a really strong culture internally, and that's kind of building a bit on Ali's point, where if people are trusted with the information they need to get their jobs done, they can make the important decisions. You're giving them that autonomy. I think just any kind of step that you can take on that journey of being more transparent, whether it's salaries or otherwise, is going to be helpful for any business. And then the last thing that I want to pull out is that as a market collectively, if more and more companies were transparent with salaries, especially on their jobs again, it really helps with pay equality where there are huge problems, and it kind of shows that you care about that as an organization. So we know already from various studies that women in underrepresented groups especially are often paid far less than men, and are also less likely to negotiate than white men. And if people from those groups are coming to an interview with lower expectations because you don't have a public salary range and they're flying blind, then you're reinforcing that gap. You're not helping to close the gap there. And this is a real problem at the moment. We ask candidates on Otta to set minimum expected salaries when they're looking for jobs. And we found some really eye-opening, worrying gaps there, where women of color set their minimum expected salary 40% lower than white men. Men of color set their minimum salary expectation 30% lower than white men. And even like white women also set their minimum salary 25% lower than white men. So this is a real problem where salary transparency, more and more companies doing it, and will lean into helping us solve that problem, which is a real problem that society faces.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting there. So I want to jump in with two things, right? One experience on a survey we did throughout our clients, and then our own experience at Figures. And then I think I'll ask Mariabrisa some of her thoughts on what was said, right? First thing, to corroborate what you just did, right? We did run a survey at Figures, so we asked our 1,000+ clients how transparent they were in their compensation. And remember the different layers we talked about: not transparent, transparent on compensation policy, transparent on compensation processes, transparent internally on the salary grids or even externally on job ranges, and fully transparent, including on individual salaries, right? What we found, and that's to your point about the market, the impact on the market, right, is the more transparent. When we looked at the subset of companies, the more transparent companies are, the more the pay gap, the gender pay gap on the equal role, the adjusted gender pay gap, so looking at men and women salaries on the same role, same seniority level, same location, shrunk. So the more transparency there was on the market, the lower the gender pay gap, and it was nearly non-existent when we looked at fully transparent companies. And I think we are a fully transparent company at Figures, meaning internally everyone knows who earns what, right? And we have 40 employees who are doing what. But we are doing this because we think we want to push. We think we need to be pushing the market in that direction, right? We need to be pushing the market for more transparency because we think it will help, to your point, and as our study shows, fight some of the gender inequality and so on. But I think it also it comes with a lot of challenges, right? And I think it's a question by Stephanie we might get later on during the Q&A, but it comes with challenges because when you're exposing yourself like that, when you're exposing information like that in this context to be understood, and it comes with challenges. And maybe I'll share some of the challenges we've seen at Figure. I've seen in my previous company where we're also fully transparent on salaries. But maybe before getting into this, I'd like to get Mariabrisa thoughts on that as well. What do you think?
I mean, I really appreciate all of the thoughts, and I do agree on the fundamental principle that transparency is a key element for building psychological safety, for a sense of trust within the organization, and then that is absolutely fundamental. I do think, however, that as organizations grow in size, and the complexities of what different businesses can be confronted with. So, for example, having external salary ranges associated to job postings, as is, for example, required in the US, can absolutely influence and impact some of the elements that Theo has spoken to. Absolutely. I think it also then again, needs to take into account the context of the type of industry and type of market you're going against. For example, data scientists, computational biologists, which are very finite resources, very competitive resources, and in which the flexibility needs to be put in place, for opportunistic hires, and therefore, how do you make sure that you contemplate for those elements. And then when you're looking at organizations that begin to grow, and so I've had the opportunity to work in smaller organizations. We've grown Owkin from 100 to 300 people. I've worked in 4,000 people, like at Twitter. I've worked in Disney's. I've worked in King 1,500. I think that's when really the elements begin to change, because there are other things that are at play. Right. I think the first element in terms of transparency is the consistency in processes. Right. And so Theo talked a lot about, how do you make sure that you're creating consistency in levels so that you're comparing and that you're able to identify and have data around biases. And so that is really important. Right. And so what are the stuff that you need to put in place within the organization? First of all, do people know what is expected to them at each of the levels? And is therefore that being applied consistency so that then they're being leveled and put in salary ranges that are aligned to that? Are they being given feedback around their performance so that they can understand and be contextualized around how they're being rewarded and how they're progressing within their role and how that might influence their compensation overall? Are there structures in place to ensure that you are monitoring and holding yourself accountable as an organization to ensure that you're not having biases by location, by gender, by race? All of those elements need to be put in place for that to happen, so that the trust in the process and the transparency around the data and your organization is key. I don't know if that necessarily equates to, as you grow into more complex organizations, to everybody knowing exactly everybody's salaries or salary ranges, because I think other complexities are at play in terms of how are you giving the managers the tools and the employees the information to understand why within a certain role there is a range at which they might be found, and elements of performance are related to that, elements of skills are related to that. I think there's a lot of things at play that need to be taken into account, but at the forefront, transparency and at least honesty and in your process, and that element of trust is fundamental to build out in an organization.
Yeah, man, I think I'd love to jump in a bit later on and add some more thoughts on that. But Ali, What do you want to add anything to that importance of like giving out, not looking at salaries in isolation, but at the broader context? Or have you faced any other challenges or anything you want to add to that?
I think that the in a small company, my worry is, well, that's what I was thinking about just now, was the emotional part of that, which is that like a lot of our arguments are very not theoretical, but they're kind of they're logical, right? You want to be transparent with what everyone's making, but then you have to ask a question of like, do you want other people, you want your colleagues knowing what you make? You know, like, do I want people knowing as a CEO of a company what my salary is? And is it up to the opinion of somebody else to decide whether I'm overpaid? And what does that then create culturally? What kind of conversations happen if you're doing a one-to-one with your line manager and you're like thinking this person is paid too much, or I should be paid as much as them? And what are the rules? And for example, especially when it comes to senior management, I think the importance of it is, to Theo's point originally, which is that if you're flying blind, you're opening yourselves up to so much bias. Like, you're applying for a job, you get all the way down to decision stage, and then you get given an offer, and you think, well, at no point was this discussion had. So what if their biases are in play? What if I'm being penalized, or maybe even the opposite, because of the way the hiring manager or the CEO or whoever hired me feels about me? Maybe I talk and look like this person, and therefore I'm making 5K a year more. There are all sorts of risks there. But I think the question is to ask culturally, you know, how is this handled effectively? You know, if you're gonna start publishing senior management salaries, you know, a lot of the time people are more senior, not necessarily more intelligent or apt. You know, that's just the way it goes in organizations. So those are emotional questions that I wonder how would you deal with that? I mean, it's definitely a topic to be discussed.
Yeah, well, I guess it's an important point, right? So I'll share my journey, because once again, I was VP of People Operation in a previous company where we were fully transparent on salaries. I also made the choice early on with my co-founder Bastien to be fully transparent on salary, and I shared why, right? So ultimate transparency, and because we think that the trust that it generates outweighs some of the negative part that goes along with it. But some of the negative part, and it goes to Stephanie's question, we might get a bit more in depth, but it leads you to conversation. It forces you to have a lot of conversation, a lot of education. It will create friction with people not at ease seeing other people paid more than them, with friction with people not at ease with being paid more than others, right? So I think we have a three of client companies that I talked to that say they wanted to move towards full transparency. They polled their employees. And if that's something you are considering as an HR person of your company, I strongly encourage you to do. They polled their employees, and they had too many people saying, we don't want to move to full transparency, because either I don't want my salaries to be shared with everyone, or I don't want to know how much other people make, because it might make me sick, right? So it does present challenges. We're still doing it because we want to push the market toward that. We're still doing it because I think for the trust generated with our employees by doing so outweigh some of the friction, some of the lack of context and lack of understanding about why are salaries different in the US, why are people in the Bay Area paid more than us, why is these people paid more in sales than we're paying this role, and so on. There are challenges, but I think there's desire potentially to overcome them, but I think it's not a one-size-fits-all, right? It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all. Every organization needs to look at its context, its culture, its values, what they want to do. And I don't think that going towards ultimate full transparency is necessarily for every company. However, my personal belief is that every company should push towards transparency on job ads, right? For reasons that we outlined. And I think we will go there from a regulation perspective, and this is a moment where I talked about it briefly earlier on, but in the US, in the state of New York and state of California, now employers are being obliged to put job salary ranges on job ads. It's being spread more and more into multiple states in the US, and it's going to spread to the rest of the world. A new law has been passed in the European Union in December last year. That's going to force every member of the European Union within the next 3 years to have a similar law, pushing employers to share their salary ranges on job ads. So salary ranges on job ads are coming, and I think companies have to start planning for it. But before planning on being transparent, you need to start planning on, to Alice's point, structuring, and to Mariabrisa's point, the salary transparency journey is not a journey to start with about transparency is a journey to start about structuring your compensation, making objective decisions, structuring your pay, defining salary band, defining career progression, defining all the stuff, and then at the end being confident enough to communicate
Well,
about it.
that's what I love so much about your platform, is that when it comes time for pay review, you look at the market and say, well, for your experience level, you this is the level, you know, like you can't really argue with it. It's data, and I think that's great for everybody because it means that expectations can be managed.
And I think, yes, it's the goal there is taking steps toward transparency means taking steps toward taking objective decisions, being as objective as possible within your company, removing bias, making more equitable, making more fair, putting a process in place, right? Which leads me to CEO. I think you had points to add into that and some support into companies that want to start taking those steps towards a bit more transparency.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about some suggested steps that people can take. I think also at the start, important to understand a bit of context about where we're at Otta. As we talked about on this call, I think it's much easier to take that early step on the journey of getting salary bands on job adverts than it is to move to total internal pay transparency. We don't have that at Otta. We don't have, like, you don't know at Otta what X person sitting next to you exactly earns, but I can talk a little bit about what we have done or what we're going to do to move us kind of closer to that. But I'll just share some slides briefly to kind of outline this conversation. Cool. Hopefully that's worked. Let me know if it doesn't.
It does.
All good?
Does.
Okay.
Good here.
So I'll just spend 5-10 minutes, we'll see, and then I guess after that we'll probably open up for questions, and intrigued to get some views from other people on the call. So I think the first thing just to reiterate is that, as we've said, it's a journey, pay transparency. There's no like right answer at the end of the rainbow that everyone's seeking for. But I think what I kind of want to push and encourage like other leaders in the people functions and business owners to do is to think about how they can get started on that journey. And we think that it's never too late to start, and it doesn't have to be that complicated. I completely agree that as businesses get larger and there's more kind of baggage there around this, then it does get a lot more difficult to do. So interested to discuss people's views on that afterwards. The first thing I would say that people should be thinking about is what we've talked about on this call a bit already, which is reviewing your current approach as a business. So this is thinking about things like, where does your current company fall with transparency today? Like, do you have any transparency on job adverts at all, or are you just saying competitive salary? How are you doing pay levels and discussions around pay in the business today? Like if there's things that you need to solve there in terms of inequity of pay between the teams, or you've got people in the same team at the same level on different pay, then you've got kind of bigger infrastructure things to solve there before you can start thinking about transparency. I also think it's really important to have a shared understanding among the leadership team, and especially the kind of C-suite of the company, because if they're not bought in to why this should be important and why they should care about, then it's going to fail down the line. So I think if you're kind of people leader trying to push this through, it's really important to get those leaders on board and understanding why they should care about this and think about this. The second thing, once you've kind of got those infrastructure foundations in place, I would say the key thing is to start understanding the market and building kind of pay structures around that. So I think this is easier said than done. Like, I've put a couple of lines on this slide about building a picture of the salary bands in your organization, but this could be a really complex project that could take months for you to do. Like, it requires using market data, thinking about where you want to sit in the market, using products like figures or consultancies to help you really understand in detail what salary bands are. We also have a product on Otta where you can see salary bands for different roles in the market, and there's lots of different ways that you can build that picture and understanding. Each role and industry's got their own standards, so it's not an easy thing to get to grips with, and this is probably the kind of meatiest part of the work that needs to be done. It's also important to understand the legislation. As we've already talked about on this call, in some states in the US, it's already a requirement to have salary bands on jobs. So if that's something that's relevant in the market you operate in, worth thinking about that. And worth bearing in mind that, like Virgile said, it's likely that this legislation is coming to Europe and other markets soon. So starting on that journey now helps you get ahead of when it suddenly becomes enforced. I think once you've got those internal salary bands and you're starting to have confidence that you have a good structure in place, that's when you can start openly communicating about salaries. I think there are two forms here. One is internally. So this is something that we haven't done yet at Otta because we've just been through that kind of 3-4 month exercise of thinking about what are the right salary bands for us. But now what we're going to do is introduce salary bands internally so people can see if you are a level 4 marketing contributor, for example, what's the range of salary that you can earn in that role? Similarly, if you're a engineering manager that's a level 2, what can you earn in that role? We think this is really important for people to be able to understand the context around their pay. And I personally think sharing bands and giving people a range is more important than, or more doable than sharing the salaries of individuals, where there's often a lot of nuance and context behind individual salaries, and that can just be a bit of a distraction for people. And I might get some challenge on this from Virgile, but I think that there's potentially limited upside with sharing individual salaries of people in the team. The second point here I put is around preparing managers to have open conversations around pay. I think, like Ali brought up, that a good point around this might have some difficult conversations between managers and direct reports, but I personally think that's really healthy for managers and direct reports to start having some of those discussions. Things like, how is my pay determined? How could I get more pay? Like a reality might be for someone that if pay is something they really care about, maybe they have to think about how they can make a career transition to move on to like a higher paid role or a different path. And we think that's a really healthy conversation that companies should be having with their employees. And then also externally, like once you've got all this stuff in place, that's when you can start sharing the salary ranges on your job descriptions. But I think how you do it is important to get it right. So a lot of companies in the US have got around these salary range legislations by putting ranges like $50,000 to $350,000 on a job. That's not useful for candidates. It's not going to help, and it's not going to do you any favors. So I think having a range on there that's tight enough that people can understand it is important. We found at Otta that still having a broad range like 50 to 100K is okay. But if you do that, it's helpful if you can explain a bit of context behind it. So that might be 0 to 2 years experience engineers, more like 50 to 60K, whereas senior engineers might be 70 to 100K, depending on experience. And that's something that you can include in jobs, and candidates will thank you for that in the form of better processes and more applications. And then the final thing before we kind of go back and discuss is just to kind of acknowledge that this is an ongoing thing. You need to kind of monitor and review this over time. So once you've set it up, I think it's really important to have this as an ongoing conversation. Salary transparency should become an important part of your internal culture around conversations with managers, external discussions with candidates around pay, and just recognizing that it's an ongoing journey. Listen to what your employees are saying. As Virgile said, like, are they comfortable with the level of transparency? Do they want more? Do they want less? What else can you do better around this? And lastly, listen to what the market is saying as well. Are your salaries competitive? Salaries change a lot, as we've seen over the last couple of years with COVID and then a lot of layoffs happening. So you really need to stay on the pulse, and we'd recommend doing a review every 6 to 12 months. And that's what we do at Otta. Cool.
So if I can summarize some of the key takeaways, then I'm going to open it for comment, and then we're going to start taking on some of the questions that have been asked and upvoted. I think it was like, first of all, is realizing that salary transparency is a journey. It's not something that happens overnight, right? And it's a journey that I think that step important too, that won't be the same for every company, right? It depends on their context, their industries, their size, their culture, and so on. It might go to one point for one company, it might go to another point for another company. And it starts, I think, point number 3, it starts with taking decisions around structuring your pay, making as decision as objective as possible, removing the bias, removing the current inequality. So the journey towards pay transparency starts with structuring pay, not transparency itself. And then once you start the communication journey, the transparency journey, if I get some of your framework, Theo was like, start with the leadership, with the buy-in, then spread out to like more of the managers, onboard them into the decision, empower them to have some of those conversations, extend it to the employees, and then extend it to the candidates, right? Externally, it's like so similar onion layers approach and tiered sequenced approach towards, and not instantly going boom and opening it everywhere. And the last point being, as you said, it's an ongoing thing, like everything around HR and people operation, everything around compensation. Nothing is truth forever. Everything needs to be revisited frequently, including your compensation policy, including your choices around transparency.
Yeah.
Am I missing anything?
No, yeah. I completely agree with you on the point around like starting at the leadership and getting that buy-in, and then it goes down to employees and candidates. And if you don't have those solid foundations in place, it's very hard to do this well without creating a mess.
I think like so many big, important, topics, it's about taking the first few steps and just, taking the leap in many ways. I think one of the things about pay transparency is that there's a considerable network effect. Like if everybody does it, it's going to make the world a much better place, right? Because, if everybody is transparent and clear, then there isn't really any, secrecy, and the industry, the markets will just, it will be easier for you to pay people what they earn, what they deserve, right? And even, for example, when you're hiring someone, you kind of take them at their word when they say, I was on 55 at my last company, I'd love to be on that or higher, right? But there's no real process to actually verify if that's the case or not, right? And that's why, for example, people, when they move jobs, they end up, the ones that job hop end up earning more money, right? Because they can go and they can earn more money, whether it's a higher paying job, but also there's no real certification of whether or not they earned what they say they earned in their last job, unless you ask for a, P45, which we don't do. But then the other thing is, of course, it's always, the beginning steps are always hard. You don't want to be the first ones, because, it's like, you want to hope everyone is doing it, all the other companies, because then at least, okay, yeah, senior management are really well paid, but every Series B plus senior management team is equally well paid. This is industry standard, and it's not confining it to the politics of your organization. And we'll get there eventually.
So if I may, I think that the challenge is that, at the utmost, and I think we said it a few times, is that not every organization views compensation and what they use compensation for in the same way. And so, some people really are a performance-driven, paid-for-performance type culture. Some are not. And so then, as such, having those differences will mean that there will be contexts that need to be taken into account when justifying why there might be different types of pay structures within different companies within the same industry, right? And I think what I would say is that one of the elements is actually talking about compensation philosophy, right? So rather than sticking to the element of saying what the compensation is about talking about what your philosophy is as a company. So what are you paying for? What is the approach that you take to defining the way you define, pay, and everything that encompasses in it, right? Because again, it's not just about salary. It's also about the type of, heavily investing in benefits, the equity piece for certain companies. And so I just think it's a very simplistic view to say that it's just about compensation, and that if everybody were transparent, we would push to that, because it would completely disregard the differences in philosophies and purposes for which compensation is used, and also the fact that compensation, or the way that you reward an employee, is beyond just the pay. So I don't know. I think I would like to add that to the point to say I don't know if it's just as simple as you put it.
But I think it's a good transition to opening the questions, right? We have 15 minutes left. Plenty of super interesting question. Potentially room for more if you feel like it in the question tab once again. And I think I'll start leveraging the answer and the point by Mariabrisa to take on Carl's question, right? Carl is saying, are we going for full transparency or just like bands, right? So once again, I think we've outlined some pros and cons, and I think the agreement there is like we're trending toward transparency on ranges, internally first and then externally. Full transparency is not for everyone, and it goes with pros and cons. We're doing it at Figures once again because we think that we want to push the market towards more transparency. So we want to be trailblazer in that direction. However, I'm the first to admit that it's not for every company, not for every culture, not for every company size. And there's a few companies I know that were transparent to start with, decided to remove transparency because, once again, it's a balance between the trust you generate by being transparent with employees, with candidates, and so on, and the friction it can create, the lack of understanding can create, because compensation is sometimes very emotional topic, right? And sometimes needs a lot of context. And the needs of context, and I think it ties me to Carl's point in this, is like having salary band, being transparent on salary band says the general expectation for a given role is between this and this, but depending on the individual situation, depending on the stage of the company, depending on criticality of the role, we allow for flexibility. We allow for some fairness in the sense that we don't want two people to be paid two differently if they're doing the same role. So we don't want to be too much far apart, but we want to give us some room for flexibility still to allow for some individual differences that are impossible to fully compute into a model, right? I think there's a dream of everyone. There should be a model where I enter some parameters and it gives me my exact salaries to €1. That doesn't exist. So transparency on job bands allows you for more fairness, more transparency, more trust, but more flexibility to allow for those specific circumstances and specific contexts, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I'm 100% on a ranges for each role because it better reflects the journey that people can go through the role. You're being allowed the opportunity to step up to a role, so you're at the start of that, and you have the opportunity to grow in terms of acquiring all of the skill sets that are required for that role until getting to the end of it, or choosing not to want to grow beyond that role and continue to grow within just the deepening your expertise within that role. So again, everybody's journey can be quite different. And this is why I believe very much in ranges, but I see the huge challenge in being very transparent around the ranges and then having to do with the emotional aspect of really clarifying why different people within the same role are at different moments within that range. And the more you grow as an organization, the harder it is to really be on, in control of that message and not allow it to deviate into something that then doesn't add value, rather than really focusing on the individual and allowing them to focus on them feeling valued, whilst feeling that there is trust that they're being paid fairly.
And I think one point, and I'm going to ask a question for Theo, but I'll take a quick one from Sandrine. Right? Sandrine said, can you do it transparent externally without doing internally? I think maybe we can find it, but there's been a tweet that gone very viral recently about an employee tweeting that she found out on a job ad that the applicable range for her position was 10 to 20K above what she was making. And she applied externally to her own role, being like, okay, I'm going to apply to this role. It seems like it's paying more than what I'm being paid at the moment, and it blew up big time. This is an example of what can happen if you start being, once again, one reason that we need to be step by step and being transparent internally before going externally is to avoid those kind of situations. But I wanted to ask a question to Theo, like on the question on I think it was a question from Michelle, right? It was like, and I'm going to read it. Is there some fear in decision makers in the market that there will be backlash for pay transparency? And what are the real barriers for pay transparency on the market from decision makers to progress towards that, to your point?
Sorry, I'm just trying to get my head around the question. Is there a lot of fear from decision makers in the market that people will judge? I don't necessarily think so. I think one of the challenges that we have when we're talking to people about pay transparency or salary transparency on jobs is that a lot of leaders will obviously have started their career or built their experience in times when there wasn't this transparency, and kind of just don't see the problem with it and say, oh, it always worked for us, so why do we suddenly need to do this now? So I think we've had to kind of work hard to take decision makers on the journey. Our favorite way of doing that is with data, by showing that just by making that step of being salary transparent with your jobs on Otta, and that's going to extend to every other platform, it should make the top of funnel for your hiring way more efficient. And I know that there are some difficult questions that people have to answer internally, and sometimes there's not the appetite for decision makers or leaders to want to work through that because there can be difficult steps. But I think my advice is try to think about prioritizing it, because when you do make those steps, it's a healthy thing for your organization, just on this general topic of transparency, and just a good step in the right direction. So there is a little bit of fear there, but that's what we're trying to do, is educate people on why this is important, and why you can make steps there.
And one point for you, Ali, if you may, because you've talked about how transparent you are on some stuff that I think is very unconventional, like company finances, burn rate, runway, and stuff like that. And Max is asking, right? Do you think have you found time, because you think you've been too transparent? Have you find time that there's been like stuff that you said that maybe was concerning for your staff, and that was like overly concerning, and potentially backfire in a way that, once again, the trust you wanted to generate was overly compensated by some anxiety that you've caused by being too transparent?
It's the same answer as you had previously, which is that like the benefits outweigh the cons about transparency in many ways. Like, yes, there are certain things that maybe as leaders you can contain, and of course we're not saying you should be emotional and share your insecurities and fears and anxieties to people unnecessarily without it's important to respond and not react as a leader, which a lot of us, especially me, are still learning. But I don't know, can there be too much transparency?
Theo seems to have an example, right? Theo has clearly an example in mind.
So I think the answer is yes. I think that you have to think about your employees and what's most helpful and useful for them. We're incredibly transparent as an organization around things like our financial position, decisions that we've made, what we talk about at board meetings, leadership meetings, and so on. So I think we're very good at being transparent in the right ways. But for me, totally, there is things that are unnecessary. So a great example is this weekend, where there was this banking crisis. If I was giving my employees a play-by-play of the banking crisis on Slack over the weekend, that would be incredibly anxiety-inducing for something that people don't need to understand. They might not have been following, whereas we were waiting to get the right level of information so that we could update people at 8 a.m. on Monday after things had played out. Do people need to know that the banks crashed and that there might be like huge turmoil on a Saturday morning? Probably not, in my view. So I think we heavily lean into it, but I do think there is a line, and you have to be thoughtful about what you share and what's just going to create anxiety and panic.
I mean, I did exactly the opposite of that suggestion, Theo, which is that as soon as I found the news on Saturday, I sent a message on our WhatsApp and said, look, this is the situation. I don't really have answers, but because you are depending on this is implicating you, employees. You need to know that this is going on, and if you want to follow it, and then just gave updates on Sunday and then on Monday. Because it's their salaries, it's our salaries, it's our suppliers, it's our clients. Like, I had to say something, and that was just my perspective. Now I can ask them, obviously with the benefit of hindsight, whether that was useful or not, to have that update. I think that the feedback I got was that it was, but I can see your point. I think Max's question is more about things that may not eventually happen, things that may not materialize, unnecessarily worrying people about things that may not materialize. That's different to, hey, we're trying to raise money and we've spoken to this many VCs and this is the outcome and you can follow the CRM and so on and so forth.
Although if I could add to that just very quickly, I mean, Ali, I'm very much with you in terms of the outweighing the pros and the cons. And I think that sharing actually with educating, right, because a lot of it is that they get worried if they're not educated about what effectively the thing it means and making sure that they have all of the tools to be able to interpret it effectively, is that actually you end up engaging your employees into the problem solving. And so therefore you have them a lot more participative and joining you with what, in getting involved with what needs to be solved. So I don't know, I would still say that, at times or most times the benefit outweighs the cost.
And I won't add some more points into that, even though I had some few anecdotes, but I've had anecdotes into both cases, right? And one in which we shared the runway with the company. I had an employee in my previous company says we have 18 months to live, and an employee came to me, and this is the importance of context, right? Which is, I think, key point of saying, like, we have 18 months to live, we're gonna die, what's gonna happen? Which was like, once again, explaining the context, what is runway, what is the dynamic of a startup. Transparency is all about context and being bluntly transparent. And I think, especially in the context of a young startup with sometimes junior employees who lack the understanding, lack the perspective, can backfire, right? I want to quickly touch point on a point from Ayan, who said, pay transparency and GDPR. Quickly, very, very quickly. If you go to our transparency on John Bend, and no issue at all, right? GDPR only comes into play once you start discussing individual information. And in fact, if you're disclosing individual information, you start needing the consent of employees, because you need to justify why personal information being shared with other people. So in theory, if you want to be fully transparent, including individual salaries, you need to do it with the consent of employees. But I think besides GDPR, you probably need the consent of employees just from a cultural perspective before starting to share their salaries. But it is a GDPR concern. And I think I want to take 57. I think we have room for like potentially 1, 2, 3, maybe ambitious question. I think the most vetted one was a tough one, was the one for Stephanie, but which ties into this question about context, right? She's saying, how do you transparent when there's several countries and regions, right? It's a super important point, because then compensation becomes more complex, more nuanced. And once again, we get back to this topic of the importance of context, the importance of nuance, and the importance of education. Why are salaries twice higher in the US, in the Bay Area, compared to London and France? Partially because of the labor market, partially because of the dynamic and the structure of pay compensation, where in the US, you have to pay a lot out of your salary for health insurance. Meanwhile, in France or in the UK and other areas, there's a lot of the employer has to pay. So in fact, some of the employer costs in Europe is shifted towards including the salary in the US, to explain. And if people don't have that context, they might misinterpret why are salaries in the US more important, and they need that context, which explains that the more global you are, the more complex you are as an organization, the more pay transparency becomes difficult, because you have to teach that nuance to people. If not, they will misinterpret it, and they will misunderstand lack the context necessary to interpret it well.
I just want to add one thing to that, which is it can go both ways, which is that if you pay people in, for example, Southeast Asia 50% less, yes, of course, there is a context to that, but we have to think about the societal impact. Like beautiful changes in the last few years with employers of record becoming, larger companies that are enabling people to stay in their countries of origin and therefore, keep the earnings in their communities rather than moving to the US, the UK, Europe, and sending it all in remittance. It's great, I think, globally for people to be paid, even if they live in the Philippines, for example, a really good kind of in comparison to Europe's salary, if they have the capabilities and the skills to do those jobs, rather than relying on, for example, paying someone 50% of the salary because you can get away with it, or 60% of the salary because that's just what's expected in those countries. What I love about, for example, Oyster HR is that they're enabling a redistribution of wealth in their own little way, rather than forcing someone to move to Paris, for example, or London to work, and send all the money back. They can stay with their families. People that don't see their families for years and years and years just so that they can get a job that supports their family. So that there is that element as well, I think.
Thanks for your point, Ali. And on that, we're come to a close to a webinar. I hope you all found it very informative and resourceful and thought-provoking into the bigger picture. I thought you found it also actionable to apply some of the advice and lessons learned from different companies of different sizes within your own context. But once again, it's not one size fits all. It's a journey that's true to your own company, true to your own setup. And I hope we help you potentially get started with this journey. Thanks a lot for attending. Thanks a lot, Mariabrisa, Theo, Ali, for joining us on the webinar. Thank you, everyone who attended. And have a great day and a great end of the week.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.